So I am so pleased to be able to introduce Dean Erika James and Reid Hoffman. For all of you, they don't need much of an introduction, but I'm very excited to be able to listen in this talk. I think if you don't know Reid, besides being a co-founder of LinkedIn and one of the most successful venture investors of all time, and just starting a company, launching a company today,
Yes.
Manus, to do drug discovery with AI, among many other things.
Targeting cancer.
Targeting cancer,
Yes.
In particular. So in addition to all of this, he's also the author of Superagency, which I think you all have copies of. And I find this a really exciting book because we are really thinking a lot about AI at the Wharton School. We think it's going to touch almost everything of what we all do, what we care about, what our students do for a living, what people in business do for a living. And a lot is happening all at once, and some of that's good, some of that's bad. And our goal really is to think about how do we steer these things to the best? How do we envision a better world using AI? Because we have to mitigate the downside risk, but we also have to think about taking advantage of the many new things that AI lets us do. And that's what I really like about the book, is it lays out an optimistic vision about how we can use our own agency and take control over where things are heading. And that's certainly been the mission of the Wharton School and our new investment and work into AI. And I'm very excited to hear the conversation the two of you have together. So thank you for letting me introduce you, and see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Ethan. Welcome.
Thank you.
So I learned just a few minutes ago, I asked Reid when the last time he was on Penn's campus, and he said when he was here touring for his college student admissions days.
It's been a few years.
It's been a few years, so I welcomed him back. We're really thrilled that you're here, and you've done a few things since that time.
One or two.
One or two. But I want to start with Superagency, which, as you all now know, comes out tomorrow. You all have the book. The name isn't necessarily intuitive with the content. So just start with the name, first of all. Where did Superagency come from?
Well, and I'll give a slightly longer answer just because I think it's helpful. When I was looking at all of the different dialogue that happens around AI and all of the different challenges, because obviously what tends to happen in most of the dialogue is worried about this, worried about this, worried about this. And so, worried about job displacement, worried about misinformation and democracy, worried about privacy. They're all actually, in fact, worries about human agency. Because it's kind of like, do I lose my agency in my job? Do I lose my agency as a participant in democracy? Do I lose my agency in terms of my kind of sense of identity and preservation around my privacy? And what I realized was when you look back at all of these different technologies that have kind of elevated the human condition, the written word, printing press, electricity, computers, etc. This is always how the dialogue around these things start, which is, oh my gosh, it's the end of human agency, it's the end of human society, etc. And yet when you look back from where we are now, and you think, for example, the dialogue around AI is very similar to the dialogue around the printing press, to destroy human cognition, destroy misinformation, knowledge in society, et cetera, and yet we have nothing of our modern society without the printing press. And so actually, in fact, what these technologies do is these technologies give us superpowers. And part of the notion is not just superpowers for individuals, but superpowers for society. And that once lots of people, in this case, modern world, millions of people get access to the same technology, we collectively, both individually and as a groups, get superagency. So I'll use a parallel, which is car comes out, another one of these technologies. And by the way, there were similar discussions about how it might destroy the institution of families and other things and all the early parts of this. Car comes out and you say, hey, it gives me superpowers. I can drive places. I have mobility. Well, your friends can come visit. A doctor can do home visits, etc. Like by all of you getting the same or similar superpowers, your agency is being increased by them getting it as well. And that is essentially what the key argument around AI is that it isn't just like, yes, it will be an enhancement for each of us individually, but we will also get superagency by all getting access, or vast majority.
Yeah, thank you for that. It prompted 12 other questions that are not on the list of approved questions that I'm supposed to ask you, so I'm going to go off script here a little bit.
Excellent.
Or at least out of order. So you described a couple of different prior technologies. You described the printing press, the computer, the car. All of those are very tangible. You can see, feel, touch, manipulate them in certain ways. AI is ephemeral, it's not tangible, you can't manipulate it in the same way physically. And so I'm wondering if part of the challenge we're having now with trusting AI, with knowing how it's going to be, is because we can't physically see it and feel it in ways that we have with most of the other technologies that have really changed the world.
Well, I think there are legitimate things where it's new and kind of like, is this one different than all these other ones? But we forget how much even the other tangible ones, like the mistrust of it is in the dialogue for every new main technology, right? So like when cars were first allowed on the street, they had to have someone walking in front of them waving an orange flag because they were dangerous, right? So like the mistrust isn't just because it's intangible, it's because it's changing like my sense of like my space and my agency and other kind of thing, and it's transforming it. Now, and obviously AI will have a lot of different tangible elements, robotics, other kinds of things, so those will be there too. Now, I think that part of course, what particularly freaks people out about AI, and again, part of the reason I chose superagency and is you say, well, it's an agent. Does that mean it taking away my agency? Right, because it's like, oh, it's agentic. Well, how does that work? And the actually, by the way, agency transforms. So, for example, when cars came out, if you said my agency was I was a driver of a horse and buggy carriage, your agency starts going down. It is the kind of thing that happens. Like the agency transforms in these cases, and so I think that part of that being okay, it's cognitive. It's spreading very fast. It can spread through, we have this globally internet, mobile connected universe. It can do that. The transformation may be, it's going to be at a faster speed than anything else in history. All of those are like legitimate, like, oh, those are real navigational obstacles, things that we have to navigate. And then, of course, we're not living in a time where people are particularly trusting of any institutions, including, companies and everything else. So you have that as a trust issue too. And as you know, part of my suggestion is say, look, the way to gain some knowledge, agency, potentially trust in this is to go play with it. And that's part of why iterative deployment is so important. And part of the reason why, kind of a little accidentally, but it was really important that OpenAI did the ChatGPT research release, which ended up becoming a product release.
Yeah. So I also want to go back to something you said in the opening, and this was in passing. You mentioned, soon everyone is going to have access to this. And then you said, well, maybe everyone or almost everyone. Yeah. So what is your prediction with respect to the universality of this technology, of AI, either domestically or around the world? And how will that impact, if there are people who aren't able to access it in the same way or to the same extent, what is that going to mean about the future of how we engage across the world?
Well, I do think that it's generally speaking, just like providing mobile and internet services, I think that's kind of a parallel to try to get everybody into that as possible is a good goal and outcome. And, someone told me recently, I haven't cross-checked this, so this could be a human hallucination, that there is, like 3/4 of the world has a mobile phone. And I do think that anyone who has access to a, kind of a network connected device that can do data can have access to AI. And so I think that's a good thing. And, mobile phones, make a difference for, kind of individual farmers trying to figure out where they take their products to market and all the rest. And you can imagine how AI could actually really help with that. It's just another service. Matter of fact, one of the things that a friend of mine was telling me about recently was in a relatively obscure foreign country where the cab driver did not speak English but was using ChatGPT as the translator for going places. And basically one cab driver has figured that out and then told all the other ones, and that's what they do now for this. And so I think broad access, in one sense, will very naturally happen, which is very good. I mean, it's kind of the similar way of like when you get to smartphones, kind of the same smartphone that Bill Gates has is the same smartphone that the Uber driver has, because when it's produced in this kind of basis through this technology, you get a very, very broad. Now that doesn't mean that there won't be unevenness and as usual, folks who have more assets and everything else might have special versions or some kind of increase. And the reason I was caveating, asterisking my statement is I went, oh yeah, still there's a quarter of the world that doesn't have mobile phones, today. So it's not like, and if you don't have a mobile phone, you're probably not going to have access to AI.
Right, yeah, understood. In your book, the early chapters, you describe 4 archetypes: doomers, gloomers, zoomers, and bloomers. So for those of us who haven't read the book yet, because it's literally in their hands
Yes.
right now, describe what those 4 types of people are.
So, I'm not, the doomers call themselves this, so I'm not actually name calling, just to be clear for folks. Doomers basically say AI is a disaster, it's an existential risk for humanity, we should just stop, and we shouldn't create AI. Terminator robot, is kind of the classic zone of argument. Gloomers are AI is inevitable. Multiple companies, multiple countries, et cetera, are producing it will be created, but it's not going to be so great. Be a lot of job displacement. I don't really, it's going to change society from its current golden age to a less golden age. I'm not very happy about that. Zoomers are anything we can do with technology, including AI, is great. We should hit the accelerator and we should just go into the future. And that, look at all this great stuff we've had from technology in the past. Bloomers, which I put myself in the category of, are closest to Zoomers, but they're also like, let's drive intelligently. Like there's potholes, curves in the roads. Let's slow down for them. Let's pay attention to the kind of the what are the points that are coming up in the criticism and the dialogue to navigate. It doesn't mean like slow down a lot, because like if we're living in this cognitive industrial revolution, the very beginning of it, those industries, those countries that embrace the cognitive industrial revolution will have a similar kind of benefit to those industries and countries that embrace the industrial revolution. And that's very important for our children, grandchildren, generations to come. That's something we have to do. The transition is going to be very painful and very difficult. Let's try to make it less so. Let's try to be human about it. But the bloomers, like, let's understand risk and navigate it intelligently, but still be trying to get to that, kind of much better future.
Should we try something with the audience?
Sure.
And do a poll?
Absolutely.
To see where people
Yes.
find themselves? So if you consider yourself to be a doomer, raise your hand. This is a group of Wharton audience. Nobody's going to
Yes.
claim that they're not. All right.
And also, they elected. It says they elected to come here.
Right, exactly. Any gloomers? A little bit of skepticism? A couple hands over there. Zoomers? And bloomers? Got it.
I clearly come to the right place.
Do you know any? Do you think that there's a demographic cohort effect when you think about those archetypes? Are, for example, older people more likely to be one or the other, or younger people more likely to be one or the other? Or people in metropolitan areas versus rural areas? Have you given any consideration to that?
It would be mostly speculation. It would be something obviously could poll a little bit. I would generally tend to go older is probably more gloomy doomy. Mm-hmm. Also, people who are kind of like there are a lot of smart people who are doomers, but it's because they kind of go through this. Well, it's thinking much faster than we are. Why is the Terminator not inevitable? And the short answer is you can't disprove that there'll never be a kind of a Terminator risk, but you should look at human existential risks as a portfolio. And a small number of years ago, we went through what was actually, in fact, on a mortality basis, a relatively mild pandemic. We're going to get more pandemics. The only way that I can see to prevent / solve future pandemics is AI. And so I go, okay, look, I think just creating AI, I think our existential risk index improves, even though you can add a Terminator robot into the mix.
Interesting. So one of the things that you talk about in Superagency, Reid, is to think about the ways in which we within institutions need to facilitate the superagency from becoming. What are things that we can, as leaders or as educators, what role do we play in bringing our constituents along with respect to AI?
So I think part of the thing, I mean, you guys are doing this, today too, but I think part of the thing is to say, get people engaged, because part of what I think it's important is to move from AI fearful, AI skeptical, AI uncertain, to AI curious. And part of what I think you want to be doing as leaders is to get people to kind of approach more from a open mindset versus a closed. Closed and fear usually tend to go together. And to see what they can see by experimenting and playing with it. I think that you want to encourage that in various ways. And, for example, I will frequently end up talking to people who haven't yet used ChatGPT, haven't yet used the audio version, which I think is an important thing to try. I will literally pull my phone out of my pocket, turn it on, put on, kind of the audio mode, do a couple prompts with the person of things that I would imagine they would be interested in, then say, okay, now you do one, right?
Yeah.
Because okay, I don't have to prep, I don't have to read, AI for Dummies before I do this, I just have to engage as a way of doing it. And I think that's what you want from leadership, from individuals to teams to organizations. It's what are the things that you go, okay, you are engaging and you're bringing an active mind. And one of the things that I tell people is say, if you haven't figured out in something and look, there's all this classic write a sonnet or do a recipe and all the rest, but in the things you care about, if you haven't actually figured out a way to use AI in a way that's useful to you, you just haven't been trying hard enough. Doesn't mean it's going to be useful for everything, but it will be useful for some things.
It's interesting. I was in San Francisco a month or so ago, and I was with a colleague who's not a colleague from Wharton, someone who was in my life in the last at a different institution, much older gentleman, and we were talking about AI, and he said, I've never used it. I don't even know what people are talking about when they say it. It just seems kind of scary. So I think that's probably the doomer.
Yes. Or gloomer.
Yes. And after lunch, he calls the Waymo. Is that what they call the
Waymo.
Waymo
Yes.
car
Yes.
to pick him up and take him home?
Yes.
And I was like, that is exactly, you're using it and you don't even know it.
Yes.
Which is part of the issue. It's so ubiquitous and driving so much of our day-to-day behavior and activity that we don't even recognize all of the ways in which we are already interfacing with AI.
Yep. And I think part of it is to, take for example, Waymos or Ubers as an agency thing. If you think of it as, I am being driven and I'm unhappy and uncomfortable, you think it's loss of agency. If you go, oh, I'm the one who's requesting it, asking it to go here, I have agency. And so it's the take the agentic approach.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. Let's talk about ethics. So Wharton is one of the only business schools that has a full-fledged ethics department, legal studies and ethics. And we just launched something that's called the Accountable AI Lab, because we want to ensure that the students that are in our purview are well trained, not only on the utilization and the application of AI, but how to use it responsibly. What are you seeing out in the world with respect to the ethics around AI as it is increasingly more prevalent and it's changing and adapting so quickly? How should we be thinking about or teaching our young people about ethical use?
Well, I think, so it is, it is a form of getting superpowers, and as part of getting those superpowers, how do you deliver those superpowers responsibly? So, part of it is to, for example, like if you're, kind of doing, work with it, whether not just a student or anything else, it's probably good to be, somewhat, transparent about what you're doing and how you're doing it. There's questions around if you are kind of engaging in things, making sure that because while the tech companies are making sure that the, hallucinations, which by the way, it's the flip side of its superpower of creativity, but the hallucinations are not as, prevalent. You may have to cross-check those, those kind of instances. You want to be part of in the dialogue around, it's good. Part of the iterative deployment is to me making sure that, what are the ethical considerations that should be in it? Like, is it being, kind of the right level of care around, moral topics, whether or not there's, lots of different forms of justice in society, whether it's, economic, racial, gender, et cetera, like how those all kind of play into it and kind of providing kind of feedback and access to that. So I think that's the, and that was one of the reasons why, you were like, oh, look, one of the things that's really important, just like any other human amplifiers, we get as many human beings engaged with this as possible is like, I think, a really good thing. So I think those are some of them. Now, for people who are doing the work here, it's excellent you have this lab. I think one of the key things is which are the really important questions to address as we get forward. Industry does pay attention to them. All of the major, every AI company that I have any association with whatsoever has a alignment and safety group. Does read like papers and brings them in, does look at consumer commentary and engagement in order to do that. And I think that's like extremely important. That's how we get to, a better human outcome.
I remember in November of 2022, it was the first time I ever heard of ChatGPT. And we were on, I guess, Thanksgiving break, and I came back from break, and everyone was talking about it. And the only thing that people were asking me as someone in higher education was, how are you going to prevent your students from cheating with it? And so at that time, I thought that its only use was something that could be used nefariously for students who were cheating. But obviously, within a matter of weeks, you'd start to see all of the other ways in which that tool and others are just really changing the course of how we live day-to-day lives. If you were to fast forward even 2 years from now, how will we be using and thinking about AI differently?
The certain way to look a little silly in the future is to make predictions.
This isn't being recorded.
Yeah,
Don't
no,
mind the cameras.
ignore the cameras. It's one of the reasons I tend to prefer building these things. That's the way how you make the future. So here's a few, and these I'm almost certain that will be something more interesting than things I'm about to say that we discover. I think that's one of the things that's really interesting. So one is part of what 2025 will be is the year of massive acceleration in co-pilot coding capabilities in these machines. Everyone starts with, oh, that'll make software engineers a whole bunch more productive, and no, I don't think it'll do a lot of job loss. There'll be job amplification, transition, a bunch of other things. But then the knock-on effect is, I think, very interesting, which is all of us will have on our phones and our PCs a coding agent that you can speak English to, or any language. So natural language becomes the coding language, and then can do coding for you. And so whatever your particular professional engagement is, you now have software engineering development capabilities in doing it. And I think that is doable today, but hard to cobble together. I think within 2 years, it'll be much more obvious about like a bunch of people doing it. Whether or not it will yet be the wave, because I think the way these waves work is they start slowly as individuals grow, and then as kind of competitive and social dynamic pressures, then it accelerates. Will that yet be an acceleration by 2 years? I don't know. I also think that it will be much more common that, like another thing I think you will see even within 2 years is, oh yeah, we'll sort this out. My agent will talk to your agent.
Wow.
So.
Taking the human sort of
Yeah,
out
but
of
like
it.
we might even be sitting here and say,
Yeah.
oh yeah, and look, let's say something a little simpler. It's like, oh, we're trying to schedule when we're going to do this fireside chat. My agent will talk to your agent.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out.
I don't know if I like that or if I'm like looking forward to that or feel, I mean, it's like the whole concept of your book. It's all these new things feel so different, and it's a change management exercise.
Yes, exactly. And ultimately, the perspective you have to have, we try to be as human in the evolution and transition as possible, but it's that future human perspective. Like if you went back to, if you dropped a person from horse and buggy land into the streets today, they'd go, oh my God, this is really scary.
Yeah.
Like their first reaction would be totally terrible. And if you just kind of showed them a picture of like kind of what was going on a highway, that would be terrifying. But we live in that world for reasons that we have iterated to and prefer.
Yeah, yeah. So we have an audience full of students, and I have to imagine that there's a little bit of trepidation because perhaps for a good number of years in their short life, they were thinking about a role or a job. And if you're at the Wharton School, you're pretty focused on what your future might be. How do you advise young people as they think about the way in which some of the roles or jobs will be changing? They're the exact jobs they've been preparing for.
So I think one of the entrepreneurial lessons is how do you convert challenges and opportunities? It's when you run into something, you go, oh, that's a problem. Can you convert it into an opportunity? So for young people, and yes, I left my walker at the door. The thing that is you will have much more direct participation in growing up with these agents than the workforce that you will be entering. Make that one of your competitive differentiation superpowers. It's like, I've gone deep in these, I know how to use them, I started using them in contexts that help me with whatever particular professional choice. I could help bring that to whatever company group that you'd be wanting to be part of, because that's the kind of thing that group will be considering and will be trying to do. And so that's the broad brush of it. Now, the job landscape will be, changing because it's like, well, we used to have all this work for data entry, but now the AI can do this part of the data entry, so we have to be, like, there's different kinds of work that's going to be coming up with data, for example. And there's, like, for example, conceptualizing, because if anything, we're moving into greater and greater amounts of data, like not just AI generated, but just massive amounts of data. Think about all the healthcare monitoring devices that most of us wear, and all the rest of these things. Like, okay, thinking about how you compute and learn things off massive amounts of data is part of what the skills in using these new AI tools is for. And so, so I think that's another thing to be bringing that mindset into it. And I think that's, that kind of, think about how the kind of task change, always be learning, think about using your knowledge of the tech as a user, as a deployer, as an edge. Those would be the places I'd start.
Yeah, thank you. So we're talking about the audience. I want to get some audience questions in here and then go back and forth between the few that I have left and what we're hearing. So here's a question. There's often a noticeable delay between technological advancements on the West Coast and when they fully permeate the East Coast and beyond. Given your vantage point, what do you see as the next major evolution beyond AI agents, and how can those outside of Silicon Valley better position themselves to anticipate and leverage these emerging trends?
So I think we're literally, like the agent stuff is going to grow a lot. And that was part of the reason I was gesturing at things like agents talking to agents. Like everyone's kind of thinking agents like a chatbot, I talk to it. Yes, there'll be that. Agent that'll be representing you out in the world that may go buy your tickets for your, your trip to Paris or whatever. Yes, there will be that. But we're gonna have a lot more, like all of us is gonna have a number of agents, and the agents, like how you manage a suite of them, how they talk to each other, how you talk to them, how they talk to other agents, all that. So like don't sweep past the fact that we're at the very beginning of the agent thing too quickly. Right, that's kind of first thing. It's like, no, beyond agents. Like, well, no, there's a lot coming here with agents.
Right.
So pay attention. One of the central ones I already mentioned, which is I think the coding acceleration won't just be a software acceleration, but will be an acceleration for all professionals. I think it'll help scientists. I think it'll help, like, there's all of that. And then once you have the coding acceleration, I think that begins to make detailed professional tools, lawyers, doctors, various forms of researchers, everything. Then you begin to get, based on the coding agents, you get amplification there too. And that's already being worked on, but I think it'll get accelerated like with rapidity after that. And so that would be another area to look at. And then the other thing, by the way, in terms of agents, part of the reason I would say is like, if you're not playing with at least one, preferably more, of these agents on the audio mode, do. It changes your interaction, because one of the key things is you tend to think, okay, prompt, I get a response, okay, that was a response. It's like, well, actually, in fact, these things, here we are, kind of, management school. These things actually, in fact, do great in iteration. So you go, well, that was good, but could you do that better? And you'll get another take. Like just that kind of thing. And we as human beings more naturally do that in dialogue. And so getting that experience in dialogue is, I think, also a very important thing.
Okay. So you mentioned that, or no, Ethan mentioned when he introduced you that earlier today you announced the launch of a new company that aims to transform how we discover and develop life-saving medicines, and you said particularly cancer.
Yes.
How will your company, Manus AI, approach drug discovery differently from the myriad companies already working in this space?
Well, I'll be a little clear at a 50,000 foot level, and below a 50,000 foot level, it's a little bit of a trade secret. So Siddhartha Mukherjee is the CEO, and he and I sat down, and he's brought drugs to market, has drugs in phase 3 FDA trials. He's done this multiple times, and he's also a great author, Emperor of All Maladies, and people haven't encouraged it. Awesome book. And we looked through the entire process, and we said, which areas of this does AI accelerate by 10x? Let's deploy AI in each one of these areas. And so, for example, we identify there's lots of different forms of cancer. It's one of the things that's challenging. It's not just like, here's your one pill for cancer. It doesn't work that way, right? And
Yet.
you go, yeah, it'd be a very complicated pill, right? Matter of fact, that might be a nanobot pill. Like you may require something that like very
that powerful.
Yes, right. But you go, okay, so you say, here's our target, and then AI, just as you might kind of say, hey, give me 10 different versions of how I might conclude the essay, this essay that I'm writing. You can go, give me 10 wildly different possible compounds that might bear on this, right? And so you can use it as that kind of amplification. And then there's a variety of things we do through the entire process up to the FDA approval process. That's how we anticipate accelerating this.
So you have Dr. Mukherjee. Who else? How big is the organization as of this point? Is it the two of you, or do you have a whole team already?
Well, Sid brought a bunch of his friends as a scientific advisory board. So I think I'm the lowest IQ person in the group, so it's literally it's a stunning great list. In the company is about 10 people right now, and we're just getting started.
So I want to talk about the combination or the collaboration between different disciplines as it relates to AI. So we're sitting here in a business school, the business school. We're on a college campus that has engineering, that has medicine, that has all sorts of other disciplines, all of whom are working towards something as it relates to AI. If you were a trustee, how would you advise the University of Pennsylvania to utilize or leverage or combine the knowledge bases that exist here to facilitate AI?
So, well, one of the good news is I think you guys are, maybe even in my experience, the most forward institution on this. So congrats. Yes, exactly. If there are other institutions, I suspect they're just in pace with you, not ahead. I do think that the kind of thing that, like one of the things that one of the things that's kind of interesting, and so the answer is lots and lots of ways, but here's an interesting thing that I've been kind of playing with recently. So I saw a demo a few months back at Microsoft Research, which we find with me talking about, which is a specific researcher had created a 20-page meta prompt to prompt GPT-4 into doing Bayesian medical diagnosis. And with the 20-page prompt was better than the average Harvard doctor at doing that. And so one of the things to think about in an expertise question is what would be the kinds of 20-page-ish, it could be 5, it could be 300, whatever, get our meta prompts that embody a certain kinds of expertise that could then be much more broadly engaged with and used from that. That would be one of the ways of taking expertise and trying to get it into a broad range of utility and engagement. Yeah. And so, that's like a very specific instance, but I'm sure that there is like 1,000, including like 100 that may even be better than that individual one.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Short question here. What's your impact? What is your opinion on the environmental impact of AI?
So some people kind of it's and I know that's not necessarily what's behind this question, but but it's a problem because it's using a whole bunch of electricity. And you're like, well, data centers, currently are using maybe 5% of electricity, and AI stuff within the data centers is maybe using, 5% of that. So currently it's not very big. It's growing, and it will grow at a fast rate. So, anticipation. But then the question is all of the hyperscalers have made very strong commitments to making the new data centers completely green energy. This isn't just like, there's no problem for the energy for AI. It's actually a huge benefit for society, because what they're doing is they're going out and making multi-billion-dollar, almost like venture customer bets to like geothermal companies and wind and solar and others in order to be building substantive electricity power generation that's completely green. So they're getting all of these other companies and industries off the ground for that, which then, of course, can then sell other power plants too, including for heating and other kinds of things. So launching the kind of green energy and accelerating that. So that's one benefit. The other one is AI applying it to itself. There's a known and an unknown. The known is there was an internal dialogue at Google where said, oh, we have the world's best engineering. There's no way that AI can help us manage our electricity in our data centers. We're the best at it. So DeepMind did it and discovered a minimum 15% energy savings within the Google data centers. Think if you're applying that AI to like grid management and everything else. So applying intelligence to it in order to get savings and generation and all the rest. Now the unknown is there are people experimenting with, can you do magnetic containment using AI as the governor to potentially create fusion? And by the way, if people aren't familiar, if you can get fusion going, we can solve climate change. Because it's basically plentiful, cheap, non-carbon energy, and then you can remove carbon, and you're fine, right? So it's so for me, I think AI is a strong positive across all of this.
Which begs the question for me, does AI have a marketing problem?
Well, every new technology when it comes out, the big challenge is human beings are really bad at technology transformations, right? So like, take the printing press.
The adoption of them?
Yes, and the integration in society. So the printing press, we cannot have our modern society without the printing press. No medicine, no scientific method, no kind of broad-based education, the kind of things we have now. We need all that. So when the printing press comes out, what do human beings do? We have nearly a century of religious war, right? So we adopt very badly to technology transformation. Part of the reason for writing the book, part of the reason for doing this, let's try to do this, let's learn and try to do it more gracefully. It doesn't mean it won't be painful, but let's try to do it better now. That's actually where I have most of my worries.
Yeah, okay. Another question from LinkedIn. What's Reid's take on how DeepSeek alters the AI landscape?
Let's see, and 2 hours later. Well, the simple one's obvious, which is when I and a bunch of my friends were going around last year saying that the race is on with China, we'd sometimes get a lot of pushback saying, no, you're just saying that so that you're trying to justify the fact that you should, it is smart that you're moving quickly. And I think, well, we've been proven right that the race is on. And I think that there's elements of the DeepSeek stuff that are just really great and amazing. I think the Chinese are trying to do a bunch of different innovations on what do you do with a lower chip environment, what do you do with kind of open source models, and there's a bunch of good stuff coming out of that. My belief is that my somewhat evidenced, knowledgeable belief is that you can't do DeepSeek without having a much larger model. I think they were training a lot with ChatGPT, and so it doesn't then say the larger models, the larger models are only relevant to when you get there. And so I think part of what I think you will see is tons of smaller models trained by larger models. And the larger models will work to the early energy thing, but also compute efficiently on phones, a bunch of other things. I think agents and what we're doing with AI will be compositions of these models in various ways, and I think that will be very interesting. Now, I think what this shows is that while there is a bunch of stuff that the U.S. has and America has kind of pioneered in very good ways, the game isn't just a foot, the game's a wing, right? It's moving. Yeah. And one of the things when I wrote an earlier book, Blitzscaling, I basically said that the two areas you learn blitzscaling are Silicon Valley and China. China is the only place that I've gone outside of Silicon Valley that makes me feel that Silicon Valley is in some ways moving too slowly, right? Because, and the game of creating the technologies and technology companies of the future is almost always in part a speed game. So I think that's part of what all of what DeepSeek shows.
Wow. Right. So you announced earlier, Reid, the Trust in American Institutions Challenge.
Yeah.
What is that?
So I'm on the board of this excellent organization called Lever for Change, and the basic idea, because as the LinkedIn co-founder, I can say this, I think in networks, and so, or I can say I see networks.
Yes.
And so part of what they do is they say, well, how do we get various groups of networks together to really solve really key philanthropic problems? And it's a group of the network of potential people proposing solutions. It's a network of people who are evaluating them. It's the network of people who are possibly funding. And not only does the prize get awarded to the, that's where the top contender, but as the entries come in, they also get routed to other funders who might know and who might be interested, who appreciate the validation from the expertise layer and all the rest. That's how Lever for Change works. And so as kind of a founding board member and donor, this project spun out of the MacArthur Foundation. We've been talking for years about what kinds of things matter, and I realized that one of the things that Lever for Change would be really good at is like, look, we're clearly living in a time where trust in institutions is diminishing strongly. We have an issue with the democracy because of that. We have issues with social coherence and stability because of it. And so let's make that the challenge. And what I'm looking forward to is being surprised by the kind of clever idea that's a very good lever, Archimedean lever, to kind of move the world. It might be something with public libraries. It might be, it could be any number of different things. This could make a real big difference in increasing trust in a key public institution. And that could be a basis for kind of growing within that. And that's what the project targets.
That's exciting and timely, for sure. As you think about the work that you've done with companies and business leaders around AI, are there lessons that we should be heeding, we in higher education, from what you're seeing in industry, or vice versa?
Look, and we were talking earlier about the fact that I think you guys are being very smart with being forward on AI. One of my general principles that I think businesses do better than most other institutions is if you have, call it 20 or 100 more people in your institution, you need to have a tech strategy. And a tech strategy is not, do I have a Mac or a PC? It's where are the directions that technology is going, and do I need to be a leader there? Do I need to be in the pack? Is it okay to be a follower? What kinds of things are happening there, and how am I participating in that transformation? And I think this is, as technology accelerates, that becomes even more obviously the point than, it gets more and more stark. Frankly, we may finally, probably most of you don't know what the programming language COBOL is, but we will finally be able to get rid of COBOL because we've got these AI agents to do that, as an instance of technology that's so many decades out of date. I don't know what decade that's in exactly. And so when it gets back to kind of lessons from the corporate world to potentially the university world, it's be embracing those kind of what should be my strategies, what should my technology strategies be, how should they be incorporated into my kind of strategies for how I operate. You've got a variety of things that are already going on in the AI lab. That's obviously, AI labs, that's one of the things that's really important. I think, part of it, I'd be curious if, like for example, part of the thing that is, I mean, there's going to be a bunch of, you're going to have to really reimagine a bunch of different things. I mean, one of the things that Ethan and I were talking about earlier was, kind of what does this mean for publishing, and kind of reviews and peer review and all the rest. But like, there's a stack of stuff there that still has technological reimagination that's required. Anyway.
I like that. Does this variably create winners and losers? Bigger gaps between haves and have-nots. As leaders, how do we manage so the outcomes are somewhat equitable to raise the buoy for everyone?
Well, I don't know what human society looks like without a certain amount of both cooperation and competition, which means that you do have winners and losers. I mean, like, for example, the process of getting admitted to Wharton is a difficult process. Everyone here went through an intense process for getting there. That's kind of just classic for how we organize society. So the answer is, yeah, I'm sure that there'll be a lot of patterns that play out that way. I'd say that the thing that you try to do in the name of equity is you try to make sure that everyone has the broadest possible access. I mean, for example, on, kind of call it, college or school admission and testing, wealthy people can always afford tutors for their kids. Well, now there's tutors for everyone's kids. And sure, the wealthy people could still also hire tutors, but, that's the kind of thing that I think is when you get to a very general technology, that's the kind of thing you push for.
Yeah, interesting. What are you most worried about as AI scales?
Well, I'd mentioned this a little bit before. The thing that I'd say there's two things that most occupy my mind. I'll go in the order of the one I didn't mention and the one I did. So one is, give superpowers. So giving superpowers to rogue states, terrorists, criminals, etc., concerning. And so we want to minimize that as much as possible.
Is it possible to use AI to minimize that?
That is a very good question, which is one of the things I advocate for, right? Because wherever the technology is part of the problem, it can also potentially be part of the solution. But I think it's one of the reasons why you also have to be somewhat more careful around open source models, because once an open source model is in the wild, it's also in North Korea, it's also in any of these other places. So, cybercrime, terrorists doing various things. It's an important thing to navigate. So that's one area, and that's the primary area where I think, like, all of the industry folks that I work with are concerned about that, paying attention, etc. The other one is that we as human beings, when society is getting disrupted, tend to respond badly. Hence printing press, religious war, and that's the thing of how do we navigate this? It will be a disruption. How do we navigate this disruption with more grace than we normally do?
Yeah. We're unbelievably almost running out of time. I have a couple more questions here. How do you find your personal path using AI when there are literally thousands of AIs out there?
Is that kind of like which AIs do I use?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, okay. So I broadly think it's good to be trying different ones and to be familiar. I most often use some combination of Inflection's Pi, ChatGPT, Inflection company I co-founded, and Claude Sonnet. And I use them for somewhat different purposes. And I think that through the exposure of it, you get to that. So if it's kind of like human interaction, it's more Pi. If it's Wikipedia answers, it's more ChatGPT. If it's kind of coding assistant or more like fiction writing, it's more Claude. That's part of the reason I have a lot of be trying these different things. And by the way, this answer might change in 2 months with updates from all of them. So it's kind of like this is not like, oh yeah, Claude's good for fiction. That it's like, well, maybe, we'll see, right?
Right,
What
yeah.
the next 3 months looks like. And so, but I think it's a good thing to be experimenting with them. And I'm still, O1 is super powerful. I'm still, kind of, obviously when it's more detailed work, planning, like kind of like figuring out something that's like a detailed, like working on a strategy or something with a more set different kind of pieces, like things that are many pieces interconnected. I tend to do O1, but once again, keep engaging.
Yeah. We have to just remain curious and constantly experiment with new versions. All right, and then my final question for you is, we started off talking about the 4 archetypes. Within an institution or within society, do you want all Zoomers and Bloomers, or do we need some Doomers and Gloomers? And how would you suggest we balance our organization so that we benefit from all perspectives as it relates to AI?
So I do think it's useful to have all. If the dialogue weren't so heavily oriented towards doomer and gloomer generally, I would have included a little bit more of that, in the book. But the book is trying to move us from a, if you said -10 is doomer and 10 is, +10 is zoomer, I'm trying to move what I think is the general public dialogue from, like, call it a -4, -5, -3 to a 7 or a 6, and so you just try to move that that direction. But I wouldn't want the dialogue to be 10, right? It's good to have, like, I would have been like more emphasizing, like, okay, here are the difficulties we need to be navigating in transition. Here are some of the things to do, and so forth, which I'll probably will do later in this year as part of doing it. But it has to be with we only get the futures that are great when we steer towards them. We can't get a great future by eliminating all the bad ones, right? Like, there's a long list of bad ones, and that's not the way it works. So it's a dialogue where you go, oh, this is a challenge, great, this is how we steer. And so you want doomers and gloomers, and actually I even want zoomers, because I want the dialogue for how do we navigate this.
So we have to play to win, not play not to lose.
Yes, exactly. And this is actually one of the things that, since we have a minute, I'll share an entertaining thing I was telling a bunch of my European governmental friends last year. I said, well, if you look at AI as a World Cup football, that's soccer in American language, match between the US and China, if what Europe is trying to do is play the referee, there's a couple of problems. One, referee never wins. Two, no one really likes the referee.
Right.
Right? So, get on the field.
Right. I love that. That's a great way to wrap things up.
Yes.
Reid, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure.
Great talking
Thank
to
you.
you.